Hi, and welcome to another episode of CineNation. My name is Brandon Sparks.
And I'm Thomas Horton.
And here at CineNation, we analyze genres and the tropes within them. And we tend to spend each month on a specific genre. And for the month of June, we've been discussing theater movies. And for our last episode of the month, we're going to be discussing a director who has worked within that genre. And that director is Bob Fosse, a director who started off in the theater and then transitioned into film and kind of continued to work in both those mediums for his entire career. But first, Thomas, can you give us like a recap on the theater genre and kind of what we talked about for the past month?
Yeah, so some of the stuff we've discussed is a lot of the films tend to focus on like new fame versus old fame. We'll see like the aging star who's like aging out of their role and their fame, while we see like the rise of a new star. And we've studied a lot of movies that kind of take it both ways. Like 42nd Street is like we're on the side, like firmly on the side of the like ingenue and the new up and coming star, whereas in like What About Eve, we're more on the side of the person who's being aged out by a very crafty and calculating new star. But that a lot of the focus kind of has to do with that and with fame and dealing with fame. We talked about a lot about Birdman and kind of the different types of fame and whether you're an artist or whether you're a movie star and how that translates between the difference between film and stage and all of that. And then one of the things we talked about especially is the idea of like the third act production. A lot of these movies we're watching someone put a show together, and then the third act is just a full on performance of what we've been seeing happen.
Yeah. And the weird thing about talking about all that and us covering Bob Fosse is that I don't know if he fully fits into all those tropes that we've talked about for the past month.
Yeah, I think there's some, especially All That Jazz. I do think All That Jazz fits in the most of all of these. But yeah, I think especially that's something I noticed for sure watching him, having studied all this, is he's someone who very intensely ties his numbers into the narrative. Yeah. And so you just get a lot of numbers throughout as opposed to like the big number at the end that we're used to.
Yeah, and he only made 5 movies, but 3 of them are musicals. And weirdly, only one of them is a musical about theater, and that's All That Jazz. And weirdly, two of the 3 musicals are you almost wouldn't classify as musicals, if that makes sense. Like some like there's songs in them, but they're not as traditional musicals, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like when we talk about Cabaret and Jazz,
Cabaret and Sweet Charity are they still kind of revolve around like show business. They're both about like dance halls, but
and then even Lenny to an extent deals with a performer. Like weirdly, all of his movies deal with performing in some way or the idea of celebrity, and that's even kind of apparent in his theater career. I guess this is kind of answering the question of why we picked Bob Fosse. But also, too, he was one of the guys, or one of the few directors, maybe the only director that did it as well, that was able to transition from theater to film. And we've always kind of talked about as like theater is this, is kind of considered the high art at this point, and that film is considered the low class, like for the money aspect of it that's discussed in Birdman, discussed in All About Eve. And Bob Fosse was kind of one of those guys who did both, and I think succeeded in both.
Yeah, I mean, you also got Sam Mendes, but 1917 just doesn't really fit into this genre as well as Sweet Charity does.
I mean, you're right about Mendes, but like Fosse's a guy in terms of the early ones, and I'll talk about this when I kind of break down his early beginnings, where like he was the only one to make that jump successfully. Like there were a lot of directors who would co-direct movies, but never became like, hey, here's your first movie, go direct it, and then have a career.
But what stuck out to me watching these, and this kind of has to go with why, as much as we've studied like theater and musicals in this particular genre, why his stuff doesn't necessarily feel like it fits, because he felt like someone who was, instead of like trying to make a movie about theater, he was just trying to like make he was I don't even know how to word this. He was trying to take something from the stage and put it within the camera in a way that didn't draw your attention to the fact that like, oh, this is a stage adaptation.
Yeah.
He was trying to like make it completely a movie, if that makes sense. I told my girlfriend, who is very familiar with his work, and I wasn't as familiar with it going into this. I was very surprised at how much talent he had for like camera movement and camera visuals. To take something like going into this, I was familiar with his choreography work, and I was familiar with his dance, and I was not expecting much out of the camera because it's hard for someone who thinks so physical. Like normally, if you take someone who works in theater, you're going to have great blocking, but not necessarily great like camera work. And he had both. He had a great visual mind as well as like a great physical and like performance and movement mind.
And it's honestly crazy how easy it feels like it was to him. Like when you watch like even with Sweet Charity, but specifically Cabaret, when you're like, he had a good understanding of how to not make film be like theater. And so I was to prep for this. I mean, I read a lot to prep for this and watched a lot to prep for this. But one of the things that we read in the Roger Ebert review of Star 80, which was Fosse's last film, he goes, although his Broadway musicals have been upbeat entertainments, he seems to see the movie camera as a device for peering into our shames and secrets.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's literally the career in terms of film of what he's kind of going into. But yeah, so we picked Fosse, and you and I have never really talked about Bob Fosse, I don't think. So how many films had you seen before going into this?
I had never seen any of these fully.
Okay.
I've seen plenty of like pieces of Cabaret on Turner Classic Movies. I had seen pieces from All That Jazz, and I had seen pieces. We talked about Lenny on the podcast before, so I watched like scenes from Lenny for that. I've seen his like earlier stuff. I've seen his choreography and earlier, like when he was working on like Kiss Me Kate and Damn Yankees and that kind of stuff. And I was just aware of him as a person, specifically, being in a relationship with someone who came up through musical theater. Like it's his name is spoken in like hushed tones. He's an icon, and was so like I said, was like aware that he had gone into film directing, but wasn't expecting that much out of it necessarily.
Yeah. And this is a guy I've kept saying this when we do these director episodes of like the people I've like preached when I worked at the video store, and Fosse was kind of one of those guys. But to break down, because we're doing a director episode, I gotta give you some backstory on Bob Fosse. So stay with me, guys. I'm reading his 700-page biography. It's crazy, and so I read a lot about the early beginnings of how he got started and his childhood, and a lot of that has an effect on his films in a big way. So Bob Fosse was born in 1927 in Chicago. His father was a failed vaudevillian actor. He became a traveling salesman for the Hershey Chocolate Company. And Bob Fosse's mother stayed at home, and he was like the fifth of six children. So a lot of kids around. And Fosse, growing up, went to dance classes with his sister. That's how he got started. And two of his teachers, by the name of Fred Weaver and Marguerite Comerford. And so Fosse, at like age 11, starts working as like in a act or a dancing duet with a classmate of his, and Weaver is the guy who kind of manages them. And Weaver feels like kind of a shrewd business guy who sets up this deal with these two like 11-year-old kids basically to go around and work nightclubs and do like dancing acts. And Fosse's parents signed off on it and basically signed like a 10-year deal to where Weaver would make 15% of Fosse's money while he was in this act, and until he was 21 basically. And so Fosse was leading like two lives, one as like a student and a kid going like having a normal life, and then at night and on the weekends working at these like shady burlesque halls that were being ran by gangsters basically. And one thing that kind of delves into the book is that a lot of his first sexual experiences came at these burlesque halls by these strippers, basically. And it said that once they found out he was underage, they kind of like made it a thing where they mocked him, essentially, kind of, doesn't really say it directly, but essentially molested him in a way. Like, made it to where they forced him to do stuff as a way to have fun with him. And as he got older, a resentment to his parents because they never stepped in and like told him, like, never protected him during this. And I think weirdly, specifically with his mother, he had an issue that she was the one that was always home and never stepped in to like say, hey, maybe what are you doing at night? She never really cared as much. And so he always kind of felt unsafe because of that. And he went to analysis for a while trying to figure out what his issues were with his parents, especially his mother, because of all that. And also with women, because it established a weird kind of trend with him with how he dealt with women. And he eventually becomes a womanizer and has many affairs. He gets older, gets into kind of these dancing reviews in the 40s where he works with people like Carl Reiner. And Fosse is kind of coming up at a time when musical theater is evolving and dance has become a big part of it. And he's kind of there. And Fosse is a guy where he's trained in ballet, but he's not that good at it because his physical features are not really perfect for it. He always talked about how he had slumpy shoulders. He wore a hat in his dances because he was balding by the age of 25. And a lot of that, he didn't like his hands, so he wore gloves, apparently. So all this becomes a part of Fosse's later style in dance. But during this time, he starts training with Sanford Meisner, doing acting classes. And he was introduced to Meisner by his second wife, Joan McCracken. McCracken is a big influence on his career. She helps him, essentially, he gets a acting deal at MGM, signs a 7-year deal to be an actor. He goes there. Nothing really happens. His biggest thing is probably Kiss Me Kate, where he does choreography for like a minute. After that, he was like, you know what? I don't like this. Like, they don't know how to use me. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm going back to New York. He goes back to New York, and Joan McCracken takes her director that she was on a play with, George Abbott, to go see Kiss Me Kate. She knows Abbott is looking for a choreographer for this play called The Pajama Game, and she's trying to use Kiss Me Kate as an audition piece for Fosse. It ends up being a big hit. He ends up going on to doing Damn Yankees, and McCracken is kind of a big influence on him during this point as well. But she has a lot of these health issues. She has diabetes. She's having these kind of heart attacks, and Fosse and McCracken are keeping it secret to people because they don't want to ruin her career. He starts seeing Gwen Verdon, who he meets in Damn Yankees, and Gwen Verdon is like the hottest new thing on Broadway. Ends up becoming his true like equal in terms of collaborator. And if you want to know more about the Fosse Verdon story, just watch the FX show that came out last year because it goes pretty in depth with it. And she ends up being like wins 4 Tonys. And she ends up being a person that also fights for him. He ends up leaving Joan McCracken. He says she always has this hold over him. This will all come into play later, guys. Just stay with me. But he's working with Gwen Verdon. She ends up kind of helping push him to be a director. That becomes a big partnership. And again, as this is happening, you're having musical theater change with things like West Side Story. And dancing is becoming an integral part in the theater at theater world, and Fosse is kind of at the right place at the right time. And he is a guy where he's not doing ballet and more traditional styles like Jerome Robbins in West Side Story or Agnes DeMille in Oklahoma, but he's combining ballet and jazz and all the stuff he learned at like burlesque houses, like these kind of like lowbrow types of dancing, and combines it with these highbrow types of dancing. Whew. Okay. Then it gets to Sweet Charity, which is leading into the first movie that he does, but it ends up as a Broadway show in 1966, and it stars Gwen Verdon, who's not cast in the movie. The person who ends up being cast in Sweet Charity is Shirley MacLaine, who weirdly was a understudy on The Pajama Game that Fosse choreographed. And she got discovered on that show. So she ends up starring in Sweet Charity. And she's like, hey, I want Bob Fosse to direct this. No one else can do it. I won't do it unless he does it. And so that's how Fosse gets into directing movies at the age of 41. Okay, that's my spiel on Bob Fosse's background, that hopefully everything comes together later. So he does Sweet Charity. I've never seen Sweet Charity before this. You hadn't either. I think it was we watched this one last.
Yeah.
So tell us what Sweet Charity is about, and then we'll talk about what we thought of it.
So I did not realize this. I knew some of the songs from it. Like, I just knew it. Like, obviously everybody knows Hey Big Spender. But I knew a couple of the songs from it, actually, once I started watching it. I was like, oh, many of these have made their way into pop culture, even though I didn't like know much about this movie. Which obviously I started watching it, and in the opening credits it says based upon a play by Neil Simon, based upon the movie Nights of Siberia by Fellini, which I've seen and had no idea that it had been adapted into a play or a movie in English. So that was a surprise, but yeah, it's just kind of about the I mean, if we're comparing the simplest plot boiled down, which is the same as Knights of Siberia, is just kind of the life of an escort who is just very like happy-go-lucky, and even though like life doesn't go her way, she always sees it in a bright light, you know, in an optimistic way. And so in Sweet Charity, it's about she's a dance hall escort, so it's never set out. She works in a dance hall where the women dance in front of the customers, and then the customers can pick a woman and pay to have like dinner with her in the hall. And then it is also implied that they are also prostitutes outside of the dance hall. But it's about Charity. We kind of see it. We see her in like 3 failed relationships, essentially, through the movie. It kind of opens with her getting like robbed and almost murdered by her first boyfriend, and then there's an extended sequence where she meets an Italian movie star played by Riccardo Montalban, and then but is like passed over when his ex comes back. And then the meat of the movie is a relationship that she has with an insurance agent who she thinks is going to be like the one is going to get her key to a normal life. Yeah. And so that's you're kind of watching her go through life, and there's some musical numbers. There's some like within the dance hall, which is where Hey Big Spender comes from. It's kind of our intro to the dance hall, and then some numbers as we're seeing her fall in love and fall out of love and fall back in love, and go on this journey with her for 2.5 hours, which is why this was the last one that I watched.
It's his longest movie, and it's my least favorite of them, probably.
Yeah, I'd agree with you.
What's so weird about watching this movie I almost wonder. This is when I was wondering, like, when do you watch Sweet Charity in the Fosse canon? And I almost feel like the last one might be the right choice to do, because I feel like it's one where he hasn't fully discovered his voice yet, and I don't think you're going to spot it unless you've seen his other works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's there, but it's not as strong as some of his later stuff.
It feels like a big, like it's 2 competing forces. It's Bob Fosse and also Gwen Verdon, who was involved in kind of helping him with choreography and kind of the look of everything. And also the competing force of the studio. It's like the studio is wanting to make a big time musical that at this point they're kind of out of style. It's 1969. New Hollywood's coming in, and these kind of lavish musicals aren't really being made and aren't really successful at this point. You're having failures like Dr. Dolittle around that time, I think in 67. And so they hire Fosse to make a big Broadway spectacle, but he tries to like add little things where it's like you have like one dance sequence or there's one musical number that's all in slow motion at one point. He's also using like photographs during like some montages, which is interesting. But it's 2 competing forces. So it's like why I say it's almost the best one to watch last. It's always like, oh, there's one more Bob Fosse film I haven't seen. Oh, this is kind of a nice discovery. Also, probably his lightest movie out of the 5. So why you might want to like, I would almost say, and this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I would almost say start with Cabaret and just work your way forward, because it's just gonna get darker. And I don't really want to leave Fosse on star 80 because it's just pitch black. So how do you feel about McClane in this role?
She was fun. Yeah, she's very charming in it. Yeah, the cast was a lot of fun. There were some really cool sequences. The sequence with Sammy Davis Jr. was incredible. You know, that's you can see. I think it's definitely a movie where he was a stronger choreographer in this movie and was experimenting. You can see him like figuring out his visual style here. Yeah, but the scenes that are like pure Fosse choreography are incredible.
Yeah, it's like Big Spender. I think is like when you're like, I think I was reading a review like it came out at the time. They're like, oh, when that musical number comes up, you're like, oh, this is what we were paid to see. We're paying to see was this with this type style. Because it does feel a little bit of like a mix of the old traditional style musical with this new like trend of filmmaking that was happening at that point. What else didn't work about it that we haven't talked about?
I mean, you definitely feel the link. Like movies can be 2.5 hours and be good, but you feel it here. And it might be part of the like because the story is very disjointed. I mean, you don't really meet Oscar, who ends up being the main love interest, until like almost halfway through the movie. So, you know, it's just one of those things that might work in a play, but when you get to film and you're expecting like basic film structure, it kind of throws you off a little bit. You spend the first half of the movie with like Ricardo Montalban, and then it's like, oh, that was just like a fun little that was just like a fun little adventure she had. Here's the real story. Like that just is kind of tough. It really could have been just her like storyline with Oscar could have been like the whole movie. Really. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it was fun. I don't know that I'll ever watch it again.
Same.
But it was interesting to see for sure in this whole study. Like you said, it's interesting to come back and see once you have gotten like all that jazz, which is like pure unadulterated Fosse visual style, to come back and see this is like, oh, okay, he was starting to figure it out. It's you know, I've talked on this podcast a lot about loving like a first movie from someone when they're just like, this is what's inside my head. Here you go. And I don't like at that point in the studio system, I'm sure that wasn't allowed. But you really don't get to that point from him. A lot of times people just are like, here's everything that's inside my head, and then they start to figure it out later. And he feels like the opposite. Like he was building up towards, and then it's like all that jazz, and he's like, this is welcome to my brain.
Yeah, this is how I feel. Yeah, exactly. I agree completely with that. Yeah, it felt like he was being hired to direct a studio movie first time out of the gate. And the budget for the movie was $20 million in 1969. Today, that would be $139.7 million.
Wow.
That he would get for a directorial debut. It only made $8 million.
Oof.
Which means it only would make $55.9 million today. It apparently almost sank Universal Pictures because of how big of a bomb it was.
Wow.
And he was just kind of like, well, I guess my career's over as a director. But on to Cabaret. I'll start off with this because I'll say the people that I read were considered for this movie. Mm-hmm. Because I feel like it's important because Fosse, like, I don't know how he got hired. Like, I legit, like, when you lose that much money, it's because he had worked with the producers and the people who did Cabaret before on previous shows, and they kind of brought him in. But originally, the names that were considered for director, Billy Wilder, which feels a little too, like, getting towards the end of Billy Wilder's career for Cabaret. Mm-hmm. Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who did All About Eve. And Gene Kelly.
Wow.
And it went to Bob Fosse. Cabaret, adaptation of the 1966 musical, but the musical was also based on a play, which I think was in turn based on like a semi-autobiographical novel called The Berlin Stories. And it's basically about a group of people who were living in Berlin at the time of essentially Nazi occupation, when Nazis are coming in before the World War II. And you're in the movie, you're going to see really done, I think, incredibly well of just like how Nazis are slowly taking over society in Berlin.
Yeah, and also how liberal Berlin was pre-Nazis, which I think has been lost to history a lot. But this is one of the things that has kind of kept that alive. But it's very well known that Germany was, I mean, and part of the reason the Nazis were able to rise up was because they formed this conservative movement against all the liberal ideas that were happening within the metropolitan areas.
Yeah, and so basically Cabaret takes place at this club called the Kit Kat Club, where a young English, I think he's young English author who is comes to Berlin and meets his like kind of next door neighbor at this boarding house, Sally Bowles, who's played by Liza Minnelli, who's this American singer who works the club. And so everything's kind of surrounded, like evolves around the club and the people there. And you're seeing all the numbers take place in the club, except one is take place outside of it. And they cut all the outside numbers basically from the play and made it just like in the club. What did you think of Cabaret when watching it?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was not my favorite of his, but I've seen it. I've seen it on stage. You know, I've seen pieces of the movie. I was very familiar with it. I just never sat down for a full run through. But yeah, it's definitely an excellent adaptation from stage to film in a way that it is absolutely like you can see that they took everything and they didn't feel confined to be like, this is how it's done on stage, how do we do it for a movie. It flows perfectly as a movie and as a visual piece, and I mean, and part of that is because the musical numbers are like performed for you, but the language of it is really well done. The way you kind of like hop back into the cabaret to see somebody sing about where normally within a musical someone would just like stop and burst into song about the emotions that they're feeling. For this, it cuts back to an actual performance in the cabaret, but gives us an idea of what is going on within the movie. It's almost like a Greek chorus.
Yeah.
And you know, we have kind of the MC of the cabaret is kind of the narrator of the whole thing, and Joel Grey won an Oscar, right?
He did
for playing the MC, which is fun because he's not a character outside of the show. He is we just see him within the show, and but the show is constantly commenting on what's happening within the plot, which is it's really, really well done.
And when hearing you talk about that, I just realized how in a lot of his movies, actually from Cabaret probably onward, you kind of have this device of a character or characters leading us through the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not the main character. And Joel Grey is kind of the first one who, like, weirdly, you don't know how to feel about his character, if that makes sense. Like, is he... I don't dumb it down this much, but is he a good guy or a bad guy? Like, you never really feel like you never really get like his point of view on what's happening. He feels it's very Greek chorus in that way. Like he is just offering you like, this is what's happening, and usually is offering some kind of like humorous take on what you're watching. Like as you start getting, as the Nazis start rising to power, they have a couple of songs that are like poking fun at the Nazis, and it's kind of twisted because you're seeing like it'll cut from like a very serious, like a sight of a communist who's been murdered in the street, and then it'll cut to this like really tongue-in-cheek dance number that the Kit Kat Club is putting on about Nazis. So there is kind of this like twisted dark humor that the MC is always presenting us with. So yeah, it does make it kind of hard to see, like since he always approaches everything as like tongue-in-cheek, it's hard to know like where he stands for sure. Exactly. And so, because that's why by the end of it, when the Nazis are kind of taken over, you read it in a different way. It's like, I don't know. It's like, it seems like now he's, I don't know. It was weird. I always felt like he was like happy. Like, oh, the Nazis are here. And it's something that just feels not off in a bad way, but like just something feels like there's something more to all of this. And, but how did you feel about Liza Minnelli in this role? Because I know you're not a huge Liza Minnelli fan. Sorry to like throw you under the bus with this.
No. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, when I was a kid, and this is a hard thing. You know, my introduction to Liza Minnelli was she'd gotten married again, and her husband was like a really weird dude. I don't remember what his name was.
I remember. Yeah,
they were like all over the tabloids, and they were
Yep.
always on like Entertainment Tonight talking about like her new husband, and he was just a weird dude. And like that was my introduction to Liza Minnelli. So that's always gonna kind of like taint my view of her. I don't know.
I saw her in the tabloids that one time. I can't get a hold of that dude's face.
It was constant. There was this period of time.
It
was
was.
just like when I was first starting to get like really aware of the television. I was probably like 7 or 8 when it happened. And she had just gotten married again, and they were all over the news. They were like, "This is her. I don't even know, like 7th marriage or whatever."
Yeah,
and here's her new husband. And they had all these interviews with them, and they were both just like drugged out of their mind. And it was just like, and I mean, I love her. And I got a little bit older, and she did Arrested Development. She was really fun in that, and like poked fun at herself. But like that is always going to be the first thing that I associate Liza Minnelli with, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it is. My mom would get People magazine a lot, and so I remember seeing a lot of the stories like when they got married and
but even like as much as I love Arrested Development and love her character in Arrested Development, it's hard to like go back and see Sally as this like sex figure, knowing like Lucille too. It's weird. Some people I can like completely separate what they were like when they got older with like their younger career, but for some reason with her, I just see like her more current work, and I'm like, oh, that's Liza Minnelli from Arrested Development and like and the tabloids.
Oh man. Well, I'll say this. I think she's great in this movie. And weirdly, I think the 3 best songs in this movie she's involved in, and they weren't in the original musical. And that's Mine Hair, Maybe This Time, and Money Money.
Maybe This Time is incredible.
Yeah,
like she's great in that.
That's one I've been listening to kind of on repeat since it, and basically I apparently heard, because it was written in 1964, that song. So the writers brought it out when they're like, "Hey, we need it. Like, I want another song here besides what you have." And it was a song I think actually her mother, Judy Garland, sang at some point during her shows. So there was kind of like a tie-in there with that song. The ending shot of Cabaret is chilling.
Yeah, he definitely comes into his own visually here. This is the one. This is the movie that you're like, wow, this guy has like a vision. Which was what was most surprising to me, like I said, through all of this, is the language of his camera is as distinctive as his language of body movement, which is rare. That someone can have both.
Yeah, and I heard him say he's like what's so good about the camera is that he can focus on little details. He's like, he was talking about in dance, there was an interview about dance, but he was like, in film, like you can zoom in on the limp wrist or the sweat on the brow or whatever. When he's like in theater, it's like they don't know where to look, so they could be looking at this pretty girl over here or this person who's doing this, but in the film he's like, I can control where they're looking, and he does that in Cabaret. And I mean, spoiler alert for those that haven't seen Cabaret, but I want to talk about this last shot because it's just such a it's weirdly, with watching Cabaret, and I don't want to go too much into politics with this, but it is weirdly relevant to me because it's showing, with this like Nazi occupation in this movie, you're slowly seeing it take over Berlin. And I think it starts off the first time you see a Nazi, they're being kicked out of the club, the Kit Kat club, and like being beaten up. And then slowly you start seeing like them out in public. And then kind of the big thing that happens is that the character of Brian is at like they're at some like picnic event or whatever.
It's a beer hall, I think.
Yeah. And a boy starts singing a song. It's the only song that's done outside of the Kit Kat Club. And the camera pulls back to reveal like it's like a Hitler Youth. And he's singing and everyone's kind of quiet. And then all of a sudden, everyone starts bursting into song. And this is when you realize, oh, these people are gaining power within this country. And it's slowly happening in the background. And then like the nail that just like, he hits it right on the head in the last shot, where it's not shown like, it's weirdly, it's so, the shot is like a reflection because he's showing like the back wall of the cabaret. And then it reveals that a lot of the people in the cabaret are wearing Nazi uniforms.
Mm-hmm. And it's the same. It's not a mirror, but it's like a glass piece on the stage,
Yeah.
and it's the same thing that we see. The first shot of the film is the MC through that reflection.
Yeah. And so he bookends it with the same shot, but now with a completely different context around it. And I think that's just brilliant, because I think you could have done that so many different ways, and it would have been like, I don't know how to put it. It wouldn't have been subtle. You have to really look at the shot to see, oh, those are all Nazis that are sitting in the audience. Where did this come from? But then you realize he's been setting it up the entire time. And it's just kind of been in the background of these characters. Like we've been looking at these characters of Sally and Brian as just like a relationship or as friendship, and then kind of becomes like a menage a trois with another guy. And you're looking at kind of all these different things, and the Nazi stuff is all in the background. But he handled it in a perfect way. Real quick, I'll run through these. So 1972 was a big year for Bob Fosse. Did Cabaret, won Best Director for it at the Oscars. He did Liza with a Z, which was like a TV special where at this point they would do like live concerts, like TV specials through, I think, Singer Corporation. But Liza did one, and they shot it, ends up getting an Emmy win. Actually gets 3 Emmy wins. And then as well, he wins Best Director at the Tonys for Pippin, which makes him the only person ever to win the Triple Crown in one year, which mainly means he won an Oscar, an Emmy, and a Tony all in the same year. And no one's ever replicated that.
Wow. Yeah.
And when he did Pippin, a weird side note, Pippin was the first time they made a television commercial to promote a Broadway show. So Fosse was the first person to direct and like write a television commercial to promote a Broadway show. So after Cabaret, Fosse kind of has I would say kind of a blank check after the failure of Sweet Charity. Cabaret is a huge success, makes $44 million at the box office, 8 Oscars. And he decides to transition to a non-musical. And he does Lenny, which is like pretty much an art film. It's shot in black and white. Can you tell us about Lenny real quick?
Yeah, so it's the kind of life, it's a biopic of Lenny Bruce, who was a very famous stand-up comic who kind of was a crusader for free speech in a time when you could get arrested for saying vulgar things on stage. Even if you were inside a private comedy club, you were still technically in a public space. And people might be familiar with Lenny Bruce now from Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, where he plays kind of a side role, like a mentor role. But it was a very influential comic in a period when not a lot of people were, when a lot of comedy was just kind of set up punchline. He was one of the first people to be like, oh, I can make you laugh and also be political commentary and like social commentary.
Yeah, I heard Dustin Hoffman, who plays Lenny Bruce, he was talking about he never saw him perform, but he talked to Mike Nichols, who directed The Graduate, and Mike Nichols and his comedy partner, Lane May, were working in LA at the same time Lenny Bruce was. And Mike Nichols said, like, yeah, Lenny Bruce, like, we worked the top floor and Lenny Bruce worked the bottom floor. And when we got done, we'd go down and listen to Lenny Bruce. And he was a guy where he would go out there and he would plan nothing. He would just go out there and talk. And he's like, that no one had ever done that before, where they just talked for an hour and was these kind of like philosophical questions and these talking and obscenities they ended up arresting him for. But it was a very different style of quote unquote stand-up comedy. I had seen this once before, and what's so just unique and also jarring about this film is the film's editing and how it's just completely kind of fragmented. But you'd never seen this film before.
Mm-hmm.
So what were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it was really surprising. It's shot like a documentary. So you keep cutting away to actors playing characters from Lenny Bruce's life being interviewed about him after his death. And it's also intercut with, a lot like Cabaret, it's intercut with his stand-up routines that speak to what he's going through in the moment. So it's very similar to Cabaret in that way. We'll see him, at the birth of his child, and then we'll jump forward to a famous stand-up set he did later about like wanting to raise his daughter in the right, not wanting magazines to have a bad influence on his daughter. And so it's which a lot of times they accomplish by giving him like a beard, so that you're seeing like future Lenny.
Yeah.
But yeah, the editing's incredible. It's you're going between these interviews after his death, back to like footage of him as like a young man, intercut with footage of him as a more experienced stand-up comic, commenting on the things he went through as a young man.
Yeah.
So it's very intricately woven, and I think it moves so fast.
Yeah.
It's really snappy.
Yeah, very much so. And I've read conflicting reports of like when that was all decided of when to have that style. It very much sounds like they didn't plan on it being that fragmented, and they discovered that in the editing. I had heard that Fosse realized they didn't really have a script, so really have a good story, so that's when he added the whole interview sections. And he's the person asking the questions in the background, by the way. That's his voice you hear doing it. And I kind of compare it. It feels like Citizen Kane in a weird way, where Citizen Kane, you have this like unseen like interviewer who's asking the main character's questions, and you're kind of getting this person's life through the perspective of other people, which I do think is like a Fosse thing, weirdly.
Yeah, and it's all shaded. It's very clear that like every image that we're getting of him from these people is like shaded by their bias or their experience.
And I don't know if that was fully planned when they were shooting it, but I think it comes across in the editing of it. And I listened to the editor, and he talked about how they had so much leeway in it because they were just like, let's just move all this stuff around. And apparently Dustin Hoffman got upset by that. Hoffman was upset that they fragmented his performance that way, because it was shot more in like a linear way. And instead they're like, hey,
linear.
Linear. So they shot that when he was just like, you're cutting all my stuff out, so he was upset by. I heard Hoffman say that him and Bob Fosse clashed on set, and he said because Fosse would make him do poses on screen, basically like stand this way, look this way, and Hoffman's like, no, just let me act. Like I just want to like go off and do my thing.
Hoffman was not a blocking kind of person.
No, he was not. And Fosse's like, no, do that. And Hoffman's like, yeah, he was right. When you go back and watch it, like he's like, yeah, I realized he was right. There's a big scene towards the end where Lenny has he's in a raincoat. He does a whole stand-up set in a raincoat. Apparently that was based on a real event. And Hoffman received like a video recording of a student that was there that night when it happened. He recorded it. And he was like, it's just like, yeah, it's Lenny Bruce up there in a raincoat doing like 10 minutes straight of just like ramblings. And they shot it, and the scene it's all in one take. Like Fosse never cuts. And weirdly, it's very impactful because he doesn't really do that anytime before that. Like a lot of the stuff is very snappy and fast. So that scene ends up being more impactful because for the first time, really the entire movie, he just stays on it, doesn't even move the camera. It's like a static shot of just Hoffman talking for 8 minutes.
Yeah, that, and it's an excellent decision, like you said, because it's so snappy in the whole movie, and it's kind of like how we see him on stage. It's just boom, boom, boom. He always knows what he's going to do, and this scene is the first time we've seen him on heroin, and we're supposed to like recognize that this has become a problem for him, and so we have to. He flounders. I mean, he bombs. And we're stuck there watching it happen, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's really sad to see like this person who we've seen has this like incredible pace, and then just to see him like completely crippled by the heroin.
Yeah,
it's a really devastating scene.
Is it funny?
Is the movie funny?
Yeah, is the movie funny?
Yeah,
okay,
I think so. I mean, like his stand up is funny, and it's really poignant. Like it gets there's lots of times I ended up watching, I found on YouTube his whole set from the one they keep cutting to a set that he did where he just like brought all of his court documents on stage and like read them out, and they keep cutting to it as being like he got too deep into his obsession, and like we have cutaways where people in the audience are like, oh, I thought this guy was supposed to be funny. And I watched the whole thing. It's fascinating. It's not funny. Like he has no jokes in that set. He just brought a stack of court records on stage and was like, just wanted to talk about his experience in court. But yeah, I mean, I think that he has a lot of really like funny stand up in it. I think outside of the stand up, no, it's not funny at all.
No,
but
it's very dark. Yeah. His wife, Honey Bruce is her name. She ends up going to jail. I think was it possession as well? Like,
yeah,
she goes to jail
marijuana possession.
Yeah, in the movie. But you're seeing like Lenny become like a loving husband or a husband and a father, and then just everything kind of starts to change. And weirdly too, I think this is the first movie where I think Fosse sees a lot of himself in Lenny. Mm-hmm. Because Lenny has these infidelities that Fosse is committing while he has a wife and daughter at home. And he, weirdly with some of these movies, when reading up on Fosse, it feels like he's definitely trying to exorcise some demons.
Yeah.
And I think it really starts with Lenny.
Yeah, you see there, especially the first time we see him like unfaithful to his wife is him seducing his wife's nurse after she's in the hospital after a car wreck. And that's just like, we're like, oh, dude.
Yeah.
Like, no.
Yeah.
This is not good.
And put that in comparison, where I was saying about Joan McCracken, is she's like sick with like diabetes, and he's having an affair with Gwen Verdon as she's sick, and he's trying to split time between the two of them. And essentially they end up divorcing when she goes in the hospital. So yeah, like he's all of his movies are dark, and it feels like he's like revealing stuff about himself that like he can't do in a Broadway musical. Oh yeah, real quick. Al Pacino was originally offered the role of Lenny, but turned it down. He later said it was his only career regret.
Wow.
But this is before he made Jack and Jill.
Yeah, of course. I mean, 74 Pacino could have killed this. Like,
yeah.
88 Pacino on, I would no thank you.
Yeah,
but
yeah. This is like peak Pacino. You're looking at like in between Godfather and Godfather Part 2, like Dog Day Afternoon, like
around that period, he and Hoffman had like very similar energy.
Yeah, they did.
Like Godfather 1, Michael Corleone is got some like Hoffman energy to him, especially if you don't know, if you're only familiar with like 80s 90s Pacino energy.
Yeah.
You go back to it and you're like, who is this soft-spoken young man?
Who's this guy? So yeah, he does Lenny. One thing that happens with Fosse during a lot of his career is that he's known for going overtime and over budget, and Lenny just like goes insane of how much it goes. I think it went over like, oh god, I think post-production was like 8 months or something crazy. But so he does Lenny, and Gwen Verdon, they were separated at this point, but they were married, and they stayed married till his death. But her and Fosse had always wanted to do an adaptation of Chicago, which was his play from, I believe, the 1920s. And they got the rights to it, and they want to turn it into a musical. And so basically what is happening is he is shooting and then editing Lenny while also directing and like writing the book and choreographing and producing or helping produce Chicago, that stars Gwen Verdon in the lead role. Chicago, I think, has weirdly become his most famous work in terms of like musical. Because of the revival that happened in the 90s. It's still currently running. It's apparently the longest running American show on Broadway ever, and is, I think, second only to Phantom of the Opera of all time. And Chicago was not well received when it first came out. It's one of the only ones where Fosse lost all the Tonys when he was nominated, because A Chorus Line came out that year, and it was directed by Michael Bennett, who was kind of Fosse's like theater rival. But I bring up Chicago because as he was doing Lenny and doing post-production on that, he does Chicago at the beginning of Chicago rehearsals, he has a heart attack, and essentially everything's put on hold. And he goes to the hospital, and he is like starts to contemplate death. And death is weirdly always a thing that has kind of surrounded or has has haunted Bob Fosse. He once said, "I always thought I'd be dead by 25. I wanted to be. I thought it was romantic." And he then begins to realize, like, well, he has a daughter now. He has people in his life that love him. Even though Gwen and him are like separated, there's still like this kind of connection. She's always been involved in his work. She was like an assistant choreographer, I think, on Sweet Charity, the movie. She was involved in Cabaret, always been kind of a silent figure in the background. And this Chicago's like the one time she's like, hey, let me do this one more time, because it ended up being her last performance on Broadway. But he starts kind of thinking about life and reassessing it, and that's how All That Jazz happens. And so All That Jazz, I mean, can you tell us briefly about All That Jazz? It's basically
what you just said.
Yeah.
He's the main character, Joey. Is that right?
Joe Gideon. Yeah, Joe Gideon.
Joe Gideon is staging a play called New York to L.A.
Yeah.
Which is Chicago. And also editing a movie he just directed called The Comedian, about a stand-up comedian. And while it's all happening, goes in for open heart surgery. And this is what happened to him too, as well, right? He was having heart issues, went in for open heart surgery, and then had a heart attack after his open heart surgery.
Well, he was having heart problems. I haven't gotten the part in the book, but I know in Fosse Verdon, it's like they realize he has heart problems. He goes to the hospital and has like a heart attack while there. I don't know if he had open heart surgery yet. But yeah.
Well, in the film, he has it after he's had his open heart surgery, because he's like, I'm having a heart attack. And his nurse is like, no, you're not. And then spoilers, the last 30 minutes of the film, this is, like I said, this is probably the movie that most resembles what we've talked about when it comes to musicals or theater movies, in that instead of like the show must go on, instead of putting on New York to LA, which is what we've seen him preparing this whole time, the last 30 minutes of the movie are a musical near-death hallucination that he has. Several back-to-back musical numbers representing him and him struggling with his conscience and like his relationships with people, all in like the face of death. It's wild. It takes everything that we've talked about as far as like the theater genre and just like turns it on its head. Yeah, and it's him going like, I know what a musical theater film is, but like I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna twist it to show you like what's happening in my brain.
I'm gonna put it in a blender and
then just throw in a ton of meat.
And
like drop my brain in the blender too.
A little bit of Fellini, because it's like I kind of, when looking at All That Jazz, and then you have Sweet Charity. I mean, the hot take is that is Fosse America's version of Fellini? I haven't watched enough Fellini.
He's a much more depressed version of Fellini than.
Yeah, I haven't watched enough Fellini, but I agree. It gets kind of depressing every time. And talking about obsessed with death, I mean, I don't want to spoil it for I won't say which movies, but 3 of his 5 films, last shot is a dead person. Literally, it is.
Yeah.
When you think about 3 of his movies end with a photo or a still image or a pullback of a dead person or dead people. Like it's very dark. And All That Jazz but you're talking about, say, dealing with the musical theater, but you have the kind of the fading star with the character played by Leland Palmer, who's his like wife or ex-wife. And so you have her as this like, this is her last chance of doing this. And this is kind of what happened with Gwen Verdon, where it's like they're aging up, but they're still trying to play an ingenue role, where Gwen, I believe, was in her, almost like 50s, and she was playing Roxy Hart, which is not really a character who's in their 40s or 50s. And so that kind of comes into play with All That Jazz. And I think Roy Scheider, I think All That Jazz is Fosse's best film.
Yeah.
I think
I'll agree 100%.
I think it's where he really nailed everything I had done before that he'd done kind of by accident. He was now doing on purpose. And I heard from the editor, Alan Heem, where it was like, everything we did on Lenny by accident, he basically wrote into the script on All That Jazz.
Yeah, you've got like you've got like an interview framing device
In a way, yes.
which we come to find out is Jessica Lange plays this character, which we come to realize is like the angel of death almost. Like it's this angelic character who has appeared to him and is like interviewing him about his life and what he's learned leading up to his heart attack, or like, you know, during this whole hallucination. Yeah, and then we've also got like within that, well, they bring his mother in, and there's it's incredible, like the staging of the scene with his mom in particular. Like you're watching his mom like in her kitchen cooking, talking about his childhood as a tap dancer in a burlesque show, like we talked about. Pretty much you take everything Brandon said about his childhood from the biography and just apply it to this movie, because it's extremely close to his life. He just changed the names. But yeah, there's this scene you're watching his mother like standing in her kitchen cooking, but the kitchen is like in the burlesque show, and you're watching him dance in the burlesque show in the background. It's wild. Like it's the production design on it alone is incredible.
So the Angel of Death, I'm going to bring this in real quick. It's the only character he can't really like bullshit. Is kind of the whole thing. Is he's the only one he can't lie to. Apparently, based on his second wife, Joan McCracken. So I brought that up because in the early beginnings, because he said, I was reading that if like she was always following him, like she was always an integral part in his life, even after they divorced, and she died at a very young age. And so there's a weird thing when seeing that character, the Angel of Death, in that context of this character who he has a close relationship with in this movie. Like it feels like they're like weirdly, there feels like there's some sort of attachment to these characters. It's not like I'm just talking to the Angel of Death, like I'm talking to death here or whatever, or Angel of Death or Angel of Life. You don't really, never really said specifically, but it now weirdly makes sense that what if he is talking to a previous lover who is dead? Because then that weirdly changes that whole like relationship then, where is this whole movie an extended death sequence where all of this is happening on his deathbed and he's looking back on it? I don't know.
And I think the movie ultimately boils down to his relationship with the women in his life, specifically his ex-wife and his current girlfriend and his daughter. And just kind of in the end, that's who puts on, which, I mean, they were all three extremely talented dancers as well, the actors who played them. So most of the last like half hour dance sequence, hallucination or whatever, is the three of them. And then Ben Vereen comes in playing a character who he just saw on television and like pulls into his hallucination from there.
And so the actress who plays his lover, his like new girlfriend, Anne Ryan King, was actually his ex-lover in real life, who he lived with for like 5 years or whatever, and it was probably like the closest thing he had to like after Gwen Verdon, the person he was in love with, and he made her audition for the role after they'd broken up. He made her audition for the role.
She's so good.
She's really, she's great.
His daughter is so. I love the like dance sequence they put on for his birthday.
It
was so charming.
Oh gosh! Apparently, I listened to Roy Scheider's like commentary on all that jazz, and he said that Fosse showed him a little bit of that when they did the dance, and Scheider was like, I broke into tears because it was just so like heartwarming, and I was so in the character of Joe Gideon that like it just like it broke me watching them do this like sweet dance.
Yeah, Joe's this character that like never thinks that anything he does is good enough, and the whole movie is just the people around him just saying like you are enough. There's so many instances where they're like you are enough. We love you, and he just can't.
He can't accept it. He cannot accept it. And weirdly, that was a quote I wanted to bring into Anne, his girlfriend. She always said that that Fosse was a guy. He thought he was the best and he thought he was terrible all at the same time. Like he never thought he could reach perfection, but always thought it was just a weird like, and I get that, where he's an artist who's like, you know what, no one's better than me, but man, what I'm doing is terrible. Like it's that complete, that conflict that's constantly there. Yeah. What's your favorite part of this movie?
Honestly, probably the last one. I'm a huge Ben Vereen fan. And probably the last big number is,
it's amazing.
So it's when his character, so we've watched his ex-wife and his girlfriend and his daughter all kind of like sing for him, and it brings in him as like directing his hallucination, which is incredible. It's so good. It's wild. But then the last sequence is like he's a guest on Ben Vereen's TV show, which he's been watching in the hospital, and the audience is all like people from his life, but they're all like dead, and they're all made up like with like ghostly pale, and they have this huge dance number, and it's incredible. And he comes out and dances with Ben Vereen, and they're both singing, and oh my, it was amazing. It's wild.
Yeah, Bye Bye Life. It's Fosse's best sequence he ever did in film.
And it's weird. We were talking about like him and death and a lot of his stuff being dark, and like him and Fellini. It's so like joyous, and foreboding at the same time. Yeah. Like the stage is all colorful, and there's this like funk band playing, and then they'll like cut to the audience, and everyone's just in like black suits and just like looking like death, and he's having a great time.
Everyone's cheering
like
for him.
Joe's having a blast. It's the duality of it is incredible.
And then you just get a hard cut to him in a body bag. It is his ending shots are so chilling from Cabaret onward. And that's one where you're just like, it's still peppy. And I mean, I would love the one question. I would like to ask Spike Lee many questions, but Spike Lee comes into play. Spike Lee is known for his like kind of shot where he has like a person on a dolly and they're going forward, and the whole background is like moving by them, but they're staying still. And that's in this movie. That's Roy Scheider as Joe Gideon going towards the Angel of Death, going towards Angelique, Jessica Lange, and it's that exact same shot. And then like right before you get like a resolution of your shot, like in terms of the pace of it, it just is a hard cut, and it just and then it ends with the song like No Business Like Show Business or whatever. Like it's a very Fosse was very good at satire, and it's present in a lot of his works, and mostly present in All That Jazz, where show business and showbiz was always a part of his life, but he kind of had a hatred for it. And it really comes through in All That Jazz of like, I think he said like, show business has been great to me, but like it's forced me to miss out on things in my life that I shouldn't have missed out on. And it feels like All That Jazz is trying to right those wrongs. And the one thing is that compared to Fosse's character is that Joe, once he realizes he's made that mistake, he can't really make up for it. He dies. Once he realizes it's too late. And this is also the only movie I really feel like in Fosse's category, or at least in terms of Cabaret onward, where his character actually changes. When you look at all the other movies he's done, the characters don't really have an arc. Like there's no catharsis with how they change and make a decision at the end. And All That Jazz actually has that, which why I believe it's his best film.
It's also just it's possibly one of the most personal movies I've ever seen. Like I can't imagine directing that, being like, I went through this is what I experienced, and then like having to come out and like direct it. I mean, you've got to be somewhat objective directing something. Like you've got to be able to communicate your experience to all these people, and you know, communicate your experience over to Roy Scheider, and to be able to like do all that and somehow still like make it. Just I would feel like I'd be like curled up in a ball crying somewhere if I was trying to like
same. And when reading up, you're like, oh wow, this is pretty much like damn near exactly what happened to him. But when reading up on him and like listening to the people that knew him talk about him, they're just like, oh, he always saw Joe as a separate character. He never referred to Joe as like, oh, me. And I was right before I came on, the editor was talking about, he's like, yeah, when editing, I always refer to it as like you. Like, he's like, oh, when you're doing this, he goes, no, that's Roy or that's Joe. Like that's not me.
Yeah. You got to do that for your own sanity.
And Alan's like,
I did. One of my other favorite scenes I just remembered is it's very like small for him, which is I think why I liked it so much. It's not one of the big productions, but after there's a sequence where after his heart attack, he's like gotten out of bed and is kind of stumbling around the hospital, and a security guard finds him, and there's a scene when he's dazed. Joe is dazed and doesn't really know where he is, and he's just directing the security guard like to sing a song for him, and the security guard is just like completely humoring him. I don't know, I found that scene really touching. Like the security guard's like, all right, he's like, all right, next time try it like this, and he's like, okay, all right.
There's a lot of touching moments in this movie for a movie that is pretty dark by the end of it, but like you said with his daughter, like there's the scene when they're dancing in the like the rehearsal hall where they're talking is very beautiful. And then even the scenes with him and his ex-wife, like they have the scene where they're kind of like, when she's kind of dancing and stretching and all that, and he's kind of like, they're having this like conversation about,
he's like, I can't do anything, I can't think of any dance for this, we should shut the whole show down. And she's just like, okay, yeah, you do this every time.
But some facts about it real quick. Paul Newman apparently turned down the role. The studio, originally Richard Dreyfuss was cast in this role as Joe Gideon.
Ooh, not into that. Sorry,
but he dropped out during rehearsals because he lacked confidence in the production and Fosse. Roy Scheider was friends with Dreyfuss, and Scheider said that Dreyfuss didn't like Fosse and that Fosse didn't like him. And Scheider was like, "Well, you should probably like tell him you're gonna drop out if you really hate it." And so Scheider told Dreyfuss that, and then he got the script and read it. I was like, "Oh, I love this script. I want to play this part." He went to Fosse and was like, "Hey, I used to be in summer stock. I was in crappy plays. Like, I've lived this world of this guy. I want to play it." And Fosse's like, "Okay, show up to my apartment every night for the next week. We're going to read the script. And then after that, I'll consider it." He came Monday through Sunday. And then Fosse's like, "Okay, I want you to play this role." He went to the studio. They didn't want to cast him because they're like, Scheider, that guy from French Connection, like they didn't see him playing this role. They wanted Warren Beatty, apparently. And Beatty wanted to do it, but he wanted the ending changed. But Fosse stayed stuck by Scheider, and Scheider got to play the role. Moving on to his final film. I had never seen this film beforehand. And it's one that always gets lost in the mix of Fosse. But it's a movie called Star 80. And so what is Star 80 about, Thomas?
So Star 80 is another true story about Dorothy Stratton, who was a Playboy cover girl who was murdered by her husband, Paul Snider. Most people are probably aware of the story because she was dating Peter Bogdanovich when she was murdered, and he wrote a book about it. I think it's called The Killing of the Last Unicorn.
Yeah.
And made a documentary about it as well. So he was very like vocal about the experience of it all.
Yeah.
So that's probably where you're most familiar with it. I knew of that story. I didn't even realize this movie existed until you sent it to me.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like, had no idea Fosse had been involved in this. Nothing. Had never heard of it. Period.
Yeah, it's one that's forgotten. Like even in the Fosse Verdon series, they talk about every one of his films kind of in detail, but this is one that literally just gets a text, like a one-line text. It's like they time jump and they go, 2 months after Star 80 was released, Fosse's worst reviewed film of his career. Yeah,
and I think it's easy when your penultimate film is as masterful as all that jazz is. It's kind of easy to be like, oh, okay, we're gonna skip over this one. Like it makes sense.
Yeah, but it's, as I said earlier, it's probably his darkest film. Because weirdly, a lot of his movies before this, they're dark, but there's some kind of levity. There's some sort of humor that's present throughout. Like if it's Liza Minnelli's kind of like comedic charm, if it's Dustin Hoffman's stand up as Lenny, if it's just the comedy or the sweetness of Joe's daughter and all that jazz. Star 80 doesn't have any of that. Like it weirdly plays like a horror film. It play like, the music towards the end feels like a horror film. And Eric Roberts, who plays Paul Snider, is just ultra creep. Just like he plays it extremely well, but just very creepy, very much a sleaze bag. Just has this used car salesman mentality. And I was reading up on Oh, well, first off, what were your thoughts of this movie? You never heard about it.
I was very impressed with it. Honestly, when I saw Eric Roberts in the lead, I was like, okay, I know what kind of movies Eric Roberts is in, but this was like before he really became like a B movie staple. And it's not a huge cast.
No.
It's not really any names you would point to. There's some people but yeah, I thought it was still incredibly well done from his standpoint. And once again, kind of crafted in the way Lenny is. Like, you're getting kind of narration of people who knew her, and then you've also like weirdly got narration from
her.
Paul. Yeah, you've got narration from her like through interviews and stuff, and then you've got this like narration throughout from Paul after he's killed her, before he kills himself. Just like very weird, like very dark. You keep cutting back to him, like you'd be in this like really happy moment for them, and then like cut to him like blood drenched, talking about how things got so bad,
and how he discovered her, and how like, oh, like this is me. It's Fosse told Roberts, because Fosse tells the movie a lot from Snyder's perspective, which you can say if that was the right way to do it. But Roberts said that Fosse told him the reason why he did that was because he related to Snyder, because he feared that if he was not successful in entertainment, then he would become a character like this. And that's why I say I think Fosse is really, with his films, he's really trying to like, he's looking at the deepest, darkest parts of him. And I think that is a legitimate fear, because he was like, he was a womanizer. He slept around with a lot of people, and he is a very debatable, a problematic figure in terms of like the Me Too era, because he was kind of like used his power in some way with people. But he basically says, I felt like if this didn't happen for me, I could have been this guy. And he's exploring that nature of like, how dark and manipulative would some person become if they're so obsessed with fame and being successful? And that's what Paul Snider is. And also, because this came out recently, or a few years ago, on Roger Ebert's site. It's not Ebert, but it's a different writer. And they talked about how it's kind of a horror film, especially for like modern day, where you're seeing in a lot of different ways 3 men manipulate this image and persona of this woman, from Paul Snider to Hugh Hefner to even the director who's not named Peter Bogdanovich but is Peter Bogdanovich in a way, where they're all trying to craft and mold her image to what they want it to be. And even Bogdanovich, because she shot, why they kind of got linked up was because she was in this movie They All Laughed, and he really like essentially kind of went bankrupt because he tried to get that film released to showcase her power and charisma as an actress. He thought like she was kind of being written off as just like a Playboy playmate, and he wanted to show like, oh, she was great, she was misunderstood. And he like basically took the film back from the studio, I think, re-released it with his own money, and essentially like went bankrupt a few years later because of all that. So like he was still, even in her death, trying to control the image that he thought people should see of her. But yeah, I don't know how, it's so dark. And Fosse, they actually shot at the apartment where they lived at. So the scenes where you're seeing them at the apartment where Snyder and Dorothy are living at, that's a legit house, like a duplex they lived in. Because I looked it up online. I was like, yep, that's it. They shot all that there.
That's terrifying.
Roger Ebert said that he called it the Star 80 syndrome, basically saying Robert should have been nominated for an Oscar, but the Academy would not nominate someone who played such a creep and such a bad person.
Yeah, he's phenomenal in this. Like, it was funny. My girlfriend kind of walked in at one point and I was like, oh, she was like, oh, who's that playing the boyfriend? And I was like, that's Eric Roberts. And she was like, what have I seen him in? And I was like, the music video for Mr. Brightside. And she was like, yeah, there we go, that's exactly. But I mean, that's what he's kind of made his career at this point on playing like a bad guy in like a really cheesy action movie. Like that's him. That's Eric Roberts now. but so that's kind of what I was expecting. But it's a very good performance. It's unnerving. It is, even at the beginning when and it's one of those things everyone knows the case going into it, so like what's going to happen, and they show you him like covered in blood, but then you'll cut from him covered in blood to just this like sleazy dude in Vancouver, and even then he's like a shark, like there's just something like predatory about him the whole time.
There's something when I was watching it, I texted buddy and I was like, I feel like I've seen this somewhere, and I don't like the way he's playing it. Feels so realistic where I feel like I know people like this in terms of just like the sleaziness to them. And I think he does it incredibly well. And Mariel Hemingway is great as Dorothy Stratton as well. She kind of nails the beginning innocence of her when she's like working at the Dairy Queen, and then slowly becomes this like Playboy playmate, and she evolves to where she knows what's happening, realize, oh, like I fell in love with this guy because I was young and he gave me attention, and then now I'm like, oh, he's not a good person for me.
I wonder if I'm Googling it right now to see. I can't find it anywhere. I'm wondering if Paul Thomas Anderson has ever like gone on the record
and talk about Star 80.
Yeah, because there's very like Boogie Nights vibes sometimes. Just in that like overall feeling of like everybody wants to be a star, but you recognize that you're like watching people who like they think they're going to be huge, but you fully recognize that they're not.
Yeah.
And it just kind of feels like that side of LA, like the the porn industry and Playboy, like that side of LA kind of feels like it's played a similar way, even though it's played a little bit lighter in Boogie Nights.
It is. But that's a valid comparison. And even the score, even the soundtrack has a Boogie Nights feel to it, because it's a really great soundtrack. They have like Billy Joel playing throughout some of it with Big Shot. It's weird. We watched a very cheap version. Like it's a DVD it's like DVD on demand, like 4x3. So I really wish I would see this movie like in a widescreen high def format.
Yeah, I wonder if there would be a push right now, because I went on Letterboxd and read some of the reviews, and I think there's definitely a like renewed interest in this movie because of the Peter Bogdanovich TCM podcast that just came out like last month.
Yeah.
So a lot of people had found this, like a lot of the reviews were the same, which were like, I just listened to the Peter Bogdanovich podcast. It took me forever to find this movie. It's so hard to find, but wow, this is a great movie. So maybe that'll lead to a re-release or something.
I think I thought I heard, because they played it at UCLA Film Archive here in LA a while ago. I don't know if it was a new restoration or what, but I know they were doing like a Fosse retrospective, and I'm so pissed I missed it. But anyway, I literally I know the person who does it, and I was talking to her at the video store. Oh, we're doing it in a few months, a Fosse retrospective. I'm like, oh, that's great. I didn't see her till a few months later. I go, oh, when's the Fosse thing? She goes, oh, it ended this past weekend, and I'm like, oh God, no. Yeah, I think you can rent an HD copy of it on Prime, or buy it. I'm tempted to do that, just to have a digital copy of this in HD to see what it looks like. I mean, I honestly fight for it. I don't think we'll ever get this, and I understand because some characters in his filmography, like Dustin Hoffman, are problematic. And this movie, some might debate maybe not have people to discuss this, but is this movie problematic in some way? Because it is dealing with.
I mean, I don't think it like glamorizes.
It doesn't.
Anything about the movie, like it all feels pretty sleazy, like, yeah. And I mean, there's it's not to down talk sex work, but specifically I think in the way that it's talking about all these men who benefit off of
and prey on women.
Yeah, exactly. Like Hefner comes off as like not as bad as Paul Snider, but he's definitely not a good guy in this movie.
Yeah, and Hefner sued them after this movie because he didn't like how he was portrayed.
Hefner, by the way, is portrayed by Uncle Ben from the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Cliff Robertson.
He's great as Hefner. He's great in it. Yeah, but I was saying is that I wish I would love, Criterion would never do this, but I would love a box set of Fosse's 5 films. Like, I would like to see that, and that will never happen because Star 80's never gotten a really good release. Lenny's never really gotten a good release. Like, I think there was a Blu-ray that came out that's now out of print and costs like $100 to buy, and I'm like, well, I'll never get that. So like, it's some of the stuff is kind of hard to find. And I would love to see these films kind of get a little bit of restoration and be kind of reassessed, and especially in terms of like looking at Fosse's career as a film director. Yeah, if you can find Star 80, feel free to go watch it. But it's pitch black. Like, I don't mean in terms of a film to end your career on, it's still in the vein of Fosse, but it's just it's so dark. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah. If you're like, oh, I really like the choreography in Cabaret, I'm gonna watch more Bob Fosse movies. Like, Star 80 might not be
the one for you.
What you're looking for.
Yeah, I think Ebert talked about it. He was just like, what's the point of Star 80? I'm not sure. Just like I wasn't sure of the points of In Cold Blood. There's no redemption in this movie, no catharsis. It's one where it kind of compares as a taxi driver. And I kind of get that. Because that's kind of what I was thinking of when watching it too, where we're following this very sleazy character who has these kind of illusions of grandeur, I guess you could say, of what his life should be like and what the world is preventing him from doing. Yeah, we'll play a clip real quick because I don't know what else to say about Star 80 and we're going to move on. So, Bob Fosse dies at the age of 60, 1987. He only made 5 films. He died of a heart attack in Washington, D.C. when him and Gwen Verdon were walking to, I think we're walking to go see the premiere of their revival of Sweet Charity or whatever that they'd worked on. And I think he died in their arms, like on a park bench. And so that even though they were separated, they were still like just loved each other even to the end in some way. But because that I believe his work as a theater director it is more important. His theater work is more important, but his film work should be talked about more. But a few things before we move on to kind of our ending stuff. Awards real quick for his films. Sweet Charity, 3 Oscar nominations. Cabaret, 10 Oscar nominations and 8 wins. Lenny, 6 Oscar nominations, 0 wins. It got beat out by The Godfather Part 2 for Best Picture. He could not get away from Coppola when these movies came out. All That Jazz, 9 Oscar noms and 4 wins. Lost to Kramer versus Kramer for Best Picture. Also nominated in that category at that point, Apocalypse Now. So you're looking at you're seeing Coppola and Fosse running at the same exact time, but Coppola is the more understandable is the more talked about director. All That Jazz did win the Palme d'Or at Cannes Film Festival. Star 80, 0 Oscar nominations, but Eric Roberts did receive a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actor in a Drama.
Oh, okay.
His theater nominations real quick. Fosse was nominated for 20 Tonys and won 9 Tonys. He won 8 Tonys for Best Choreography, the most of any person. The closest is 5 wins by 3 different people. He also received Best Actor nomination in a musical for Pal Joey in 1964. And stats for the film. Most popular film on Letterboxd.
Cabaret.
No.
All That Jazz.
All That Jazz. 27,000 views. Least popular film.
Star 80.
No.
Sweet Charity.
Sweet Charity. Technically, Sweet Charity, if we're talking TV stuff, it's Liza with the Z with 452 views. Sweet Charity has 3,100 views. I think Star 80 is like 3,800. Highest rated film, or top 3 highest rated films.
All That Jazz.
That's number 1, yeah.
Lenny.
Lenny's number 3.
Oh, and Cabaret.
Yes, Cabaret's number 2. And lowest rated film. I'll read all the scores out when we were done with this one.
Sweet Charity.
Lowest rated film. Sweet Charity. I'm gonna include Liza with a Z in here because I think it's worth discussing in terms of like how you want to end me with it. The ratings on Letterboxd. All That Jazz, 4.2. Liza with a Z, a 4. Cabaret, 3.9. Lenny, 3.8. Star 80, 3.6. Sweet Charity, 3.5.
That's still pretty solid, man.
All out of 5. All very solid. Most appearances by an actor.
Ben Vereen.
Ben Vereen.
Hey.
Ben Vereen is tied. He's in Sweet Charity and All That Jazz. Also an actress, Deborah Giffner, is in All That Jazz. She's the actress he sleeps with, that like the first actress he sleeps with that auditions for him at the cattle call. And she's also in Star 80 as like someone that Paul Snider is like, he's kind of a pimp. Paul Snider also kind of plays kind of a pimp. And this is one of the characters he kind of pimps out. Also too, we didn't even talk about this in All That Jazz, but the cattle call scene is phenomenal. I just want to throw that in there because that's a phenomenally crafted scene and edited scene. They didn't cut to the music, by the way. They cut without music and then add the music in later.
Wow. Yeah,
which
that
is
works
insane
perfectly.
when you watch that. Fosse just had a great sense of pace.
I got a stat for you.
Okay.
Throughout all of theater film month, what restaurant has made the most appearances in our movies?
Oh, God. Is it not Sardi's?
Nope.
What restaurant?
Yeah.
Oh, Dairy Queen.
Dairy Queen. 2 Dairy Queen appearances.
Weirdly, not just that, it was in Texasville for Texas month.
Yeah, that's true.
We've had 3 Dairy Queen appearances in the past month and a half, guys. Apparently, Dairy Queen, America's restaurant, is what it's America's fast food. Final questions. Is Fosse underrated?
Absolutely. After the marathon I've just done, I think so. I was very impressed. And like I said,
Yeah.
I knew of him as a choreographer. I did not know of him as a visual director in any way. And yeah, I was blown away. So I think that qualifies as underrated.
I agree. Is Fosse an auteur? A similar question, but would you consider him an auteur for film? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Lots of similar themes, using some of the same people, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Definitely similar themes throughout.
And then what are his running themes? Speaking on that.
All right, here we go. I got one I'm gonna launch into real quick.
Okay.
All right, when a lot of times when you talk about feminist theory and the way that men view and portray women, there's the idea of the Madonna or the whore, and someone is either one or the other. They're like a pure holy figure, or they're a kind of like dirty sexual figure that is looked down upon. And in 4 of his 5 movies, has characters that are both. I don't know what that says about him.
Yeah.
But it says something that in 4 of his 5 movies, he has characters who are like female characters who are involved in sex work in some manner, but are all like very childlike in the way that they view the world. Even Lenny's wife, like Honey, is very like childlike, the way that we see her and the way that she views everything. And she's introduced to us as a burlesque dancer. So, and I mean, Dorothy absolutely is portrayed as like very pure and innocent and in Cabaret, Sally is like very childlike in the way she views the world. And
has dreams of like doing these like great things as like a performer, wants to be an actress.
Yeah, and then obviously Charity. I mean, that's the whole point of her character. So I don't know what that says about him. Maybe I'm sure it goes back to being raised in the world of burlesque.
Yeah, but
yeah, it's interesting that when I first started to clock that, I was like, wow, all of his female characters are like stripper with a heart of gold, that like stereotype kind of thing. Yeah. Which says something like it says something about the way he objectified women. But also, I don't know, like what the whole like childlike part of it. I haven't had enough time to like dig into that yet. But
yeah.
It has something to do with the way he objectified women for sure. And the dude had some weird, some really twisted ways of viewing women. But
yeah,
I don't know what that means yet. I'm still thinking on it. And when I get it, I'm gonna write an article, and we're gonna publish it it's gonna get professional publishing in academic journals. But I'm working on it.
Okay. Any other themes besides that one? I mean, burlesque calls is a big one.
Yeah.
Like nightclubs in general. Like, yeah. I mean, every movie I think has nightclub scenes, except maybe All That. Well, no, I mean, no, all of them, because he has the childhood stuff of him like working at burlesque hall. Mm-hmm. He has it in Sweet Cherry, she works at a dance hall. Cabaret, she works at a club. Lenny, he's performing in nightclubs.
Yeah, and I think like stuff like that that's the most interesting thing to me about like auteur theory is he only wrote one of these, right? I mean, All That Jazz is the only one that he wrote.
Yeah,
and somehow in his influence and in the way he picked his projects, like all these things are just laid out flat. And I mean, that's wild.
Yeah. What else? Running themes. I mean, just dance.
Death.
Dance and dance. Yeah. And then how does Fosse fit into the theater genre?
Well, and going along with dance, just like performance in general. I mean, between Lenny and Star 80 as well, just like persona, how you present yourself to the people around you being different. I mean, and All That Jazz, he says, it's showtime.
It's showtime, folks. Yeah, it's showtime, folks.
Every morning, that's how he prepares to go out in the world. He's performing constantly.
Yeah. And even to a point, I mean, this is the thing even in Chicago, to bring in the theater stuff, where like he's exploring that in Chicago in 1975 around the same point, where you're looking at celebrity culture and violence in America and how it's perceived and how it's portrayed, and the obsession around violence and celebrity. And that's kind of apparent in some of his other films as well, with Star 80 specifically, both with this idea of and even sex as well. Chicago also has things to do about sex, and that's present in Star 80. That's present in Lenny. It's present in Cabaret. Yeah, it's out of. I mean, I don't know if out of the ones we've covered in terms of these directors we've covered, is this the most like consistent in terms of themes?
I think so. I think these are 5 movies that you can look at and be like. If you watch these 5 movies knowing nothing about Fosse, and then you turn around and said Bob Fosse went through puberty performing at burlesque halls, you're like, oh, that's boom.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. And so, final question with this is, how does Fosse fit into this theater genre? I
mean, it's from a dance perspective, he's obviously like insanely influential there.
Yeah.
I think All That Jazz, like I said, I think All That Jazz is like it is a really incredible like capper to this month for us, in that it takes everything we've talked about and just and inverts it and makes it really dark and really personal. Whereas, as much as we've enjoyed these movies, not a lot of them have felt personal, and maybe that's something to do with like theater and the proscenium.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
But this movie feels like, I mean, I guess Birdman felt personal, like for Keaton.
Yeah.
But it still had that kind of like removed, like, oh, we're laughing at this aspect to it. But yeah, I think he especially All That Jazz, it just takes, he is someone who knows theater, and I'm sure that he studied these films as he was making them. He studied, the ones that came before, and he takes everything we've talked about and just flips it. I think he's someone who is influential on theater culture, probably one of the most influential people on theater culture ever. I mean, definitely on like the Mount Rushmore of theater. So yeah, that it's his case in particular is so interesting, because even if he had never made any of these movies, if he had never had a directing career, or if he had just done Sweet Charity and then gone back to theater, we would still be talking about him. Yeah. And in fact, most of the time he is talked about more for what he did on stage than what he put on film.
Yeah. He's rarely talked about in terms of film. And there has been like a renewed interest in him because of the Fosse Verdon series on FX with Sam Rockwell and Michelle Williams as the 2 leads, which you can find on Hulu if you want to stream it, guys. We're not sponsored by Hulu, but feel free. But yeah, there's something about him just like in terms of his style, and Verdon was a part of it too, because she was with him. Scheider even said on All That Jazz, it's like after like during the erotica scene when he was doing it, he'd do a take, he'd go over to her and be like, "What'd you think?" Like he very much would go to her for her advice on a lot of his creative decisions. I don't know how much that was with all of his film stuff, but at least in terms of the dance numbers and musical numbers with Cabaret and with All That Jazz, it's very true. Go seek out Fosse if you'd like, guys. I mean, it's I think a guy worth discussing in terms of his filmmaking career, not just his dancing and theater career. I think, like you said, he's on the Mount Rushmore because even the people who did West Side Story or Oklahoma and those choreographers, they haven't reached outside the theater world in terms of like the mainstream. Fosse feels like someone who doesn't understand theater and doesn't understand dance can spot a Fosse number. I mean, it's prevalent even in our culture from, I mean, he's also a problematic figure, but Michael Jackson took a lot of his moves from people like Fosse and Fred Astaire, even to the point of Billie Jean being all black with the hat on is pretty much a Fosse character. So yeah, that's all on Fosse. Any final thoughts on Bob Fosse there, Thomas?
It was wild. What a ride. All that jazz I was blown away. I just got to say, it's probably the most like blown away I've been by a movie of late. Yeah, it was incredible.
I didn't think we'd go this long on Bob Fosse, being he has 5 films, and Richard Linklater had like 20.
Yeah, I you know me, auteur theory, like especially people who no one talks about auteur wise, like I love that stuff. I love it.
Yeah. So next month, guys. So we're this is the finale of our theater month. So next month we're going to be discussing coming of age movies. I think we have 5 weeks. So we're going to actually add an extra episode. We're going to cover an extra movie in the middle between our director episode and our genre episode. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, it's going to be an exciting month, and hopefully we'll bring you some good coming of age movies to discuss. Make sure you subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, give us a rating, give us a review. We're also on Stitcher. Like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and look at our stuff on Medium. And yeah, this has been a fun episode. It's been a deep dive into Bob Fosse, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Thomas, as always, thank you for coming on.
It's been a blast.
And guys, thank you so much for listening. We hope you listen to more episodes soon. Bye.